Welcome to Futures Hub, the podcast that ignites curiosity and navigates the pathways to tomorrow. I'm Mia, your guide on this journey into the future, where we explore the art of foresight, community co-creation, and personal growth. In each episode, we dive deep into innovative techniques to unlock the potential to shape our individual capacities and contribute to vibrant, inclusive communities. Join us as we mine the rich landscape of foresight, community empowerment, and building bridges between diverse voices. Whether you're a seasoned futurist or just dipping your toes into the world of foresight, this is the space where we craft a future that's both dynamic and inclusive. Let's embark on this journey together. Welcome to Futures Hub. Welcome back to Futures Hub, the podcast where we explore how foresight, co-creation, and community engagement shape the futures we want to live in. In today's episode, we're joined by the brilliant Samantha Matters, principal futurist and co-founder of Eris Foresight and Consulting. As co-founder and principal futurist at Eris Foresight and Consulting, Sam specializes in guiding organizations through sustainable, transformative change for equitable and flourishing futures. With a background in environmental science and strategic foresight, Sam has worked extensively with Indigenous communities and developed expertise in centering Indigenous knowledges in futures thinking. A member of the Métis Nation of Alberta and former Future of Canada Project Fellow, Sam has shared her insights globally, including at the Dubai Future Forum. At Eris Foresight, Sam leads efforts to create strategies that honor ancestral wisdom and future generations, aiming to position the consultancy as Canada's leading foresight firm. In this episode, Sam shares her journey into the world of foresight towards building a practice rooted in transformation, care, and relational ways of working. We dive into the tension between creativity and methodology in foresight, and how she's intentionally working to disrupt consulting norms by centering care and deep collaboration. We also discuss the emotional toll of change work and the importance of embracing slowness. If you're curious to learn about ways to hold space for uncertainty, center community, and reimagine change in a way that feels human, this conversation is for you. Let's get into it. Thank you so much, Sam, for joining us on the Futures Hub podcast today. It's such an honor to have you here today and such a pleasure. I'm so excited to hear more about your journey and your insights. And I was wondering if you would actually be able to share a bit about that journey of yours into the field of foresight and what inspired you to establish Eris Foresight and Consulting.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be a part of this podcast and also the little community that you're creating out of it as well. My first awareness of foresight came when I was thinking about pursuing a master's degree. That was always something that was in the back of my mind after completing my undergrad degree, thinking about what further education looks like. But I didn't want to do it immediately following graduation. I wanted to give myself some time to think about what is it that I want to study, that I want to be involved in. A few years after I completed my first degree, I was just very casually looking around at master's programs to see what might interest me. And that is when I came across the Strategic Foresight and Innovation program at CADU. I believe it was on a Facebook ad, actually. I really had no idea about that institution or that field of study. It just really grabbed my attention and I started looking into it. And I think what I was most drawn to was this idea of futures thinking as a practice, as something that could be a professional practice, an academic practice. I was really intrigued by this idea of almost this formalizing of dreaming and futures thinking and foresight. And I wanted to know more about that. And alongside that, I was also thinking a lot about change and how we understand change and how we drive change and how we manage change. And I think that was really where I was wanting to go with my master's degree, especially change on a larger social scale. And the program at OCAD really spoke to that systems change, transformational change. So I was really interested in learning about what does foresight have to do with this long-term, bigger picture, societal scale change that I'm interested in. That was my first introduction to foresight and futures thinking as a field. And really from there, I wanted to expand my understanding and get how we could broaden outside of that professionalized academic way of thinking about futures to be more inclusive different ways of knowing and being, and how those can really inform what we think about the future as well. So that's really the path I set down after that first introduction at OCAD.
I love this surprise introduction to Foresight through the form of a Facebook ad and that interest that was sparked in the field. Because I think that when I talk to different Foresight practitioners, it's often something innocuous or something out of the blue that tends to spark that light bulb moment or that interest. And then you get down the rabbit hole. You shared a little bit about what interested you to begin with this idea of Foresight. As you began to learn more about it, were there any surprises along the way where you were just like, that was not what I had initially thought Foresight would be all about?
I think one thing that really stood out for me, especially coming from a very science type background, my first degree is in environmental science, and being raised in that academic tradition of the scientific method, one thing that really surprised me about futures thinking and strategic foresight specifically was this very regimented approach that we often use to think about possible and plausible and preferable futures, and the application of these various methods and tools and techniques to help guide us towards that vision of the future. I was really anticipating a much more creative practice, I would say. I thought it was interesting to see this field of futures thinking and foresight really start to take root in that academic environment, and this notion of there's one way to do things, there's one right way to do things, this is the practice, this is the standard. We're hearing a lot even recently about how do we certify or credential futurists, and is that necessary? And I think for me coming into it initially, I was definitely expecting something much more creative and a little bit more expansive as well, because none of us can know the future with certainty. So I was thinking there would be a lot more space for multiple and diverse ways of knowing to be wrapped up in this idea of futures thinking. And that wasn't necessarily the case, at least in my experience at SFI, which is what really drove me to think more about Indigenous futures and how we integrate Indigenous ways of knowing. Somebody who carries Métis ancestry, thinking about how do my relations think about the future and how can we embody that in this practice to bring it back to Era's foresight and consulting. That's what we're really hoping to embody in our work, making futures thinking and foresight a little bit more expansive and inclusive of those many and multiple ways of knowing, and also to really acknowledge that a lot of us are engaged in futures thinking and foresight work, even if we don't necessarily have that language. I think for me, the discovery of that language really positioned some of my previous work as, oh, maybe that was futures thinking, maybe I was doing foresight. So we're really trying to, at Eras, have a little bit more awareness of how that academic nature that I was introduced to foresight in really directs you down a certain path. And we're trying to open up more pathways for people to engage in foresight and futures thinking. Again, especially when we think about change and long-term change, how can some of these tools and practices and methods be supportive of that change work? And also, how can we not be too rigid in their application? How can we be flexible with our way of practicing futures?
On your website, you mentioned that Eris Foresight makes that distinction between, for example, carefull, spelled in the traditional sense with one L, or carefull, spelled with two L's. You spoke to the distinctions that you're making as an organization, but I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more to this distinction between the two types of carefulls and how you manifest it in your approach and practice to provide that differentiating factor, so to speak.
For sure. This distinction between carefull, one L, and carefull or full of care comes from my co-founder, Jackie Shaw, actually. And this is language that they introduced me to and shared a little bit more broadly at this point as well. But what we're trying to capture with that distinction, to be full of care, is really to think about how we're practicing with intentionality and how we're really trying to attend to our work with care. We're not approaching it with caution or trepidation, as carefull would suggest, but we're approaching it with this idea of how can we move with care? How can we move with intention? How can we bring care into the work? And this is really rooted in our understanding of futurists as responsible to next generations. So thinking of as people who practice in this space, who work with others to think about and to dream about many and multiple futures. What is our responsibility to ensuring that those futures that we're imagining, we are also creating today, and ensuring that those futures that we're imagining are going to be flourishing for everyone that lives in them? How are we trying to avoid replicating some of these systems of harm that we see in our present in the futures that we're imagining? And what is our responsibility as futurists in doing that and guiding others towards that as well? Careful, being full of care really captures a range of thoughts. But I really do like the language that Jackie is presenting to remind us, how are we moving again with good intentions and with a mind to our own responsibility as practitioners.
The paradigm shift that you are enacting, this change in thinking, is so important and so needed. I find it interesting to see how you insert that type of thinking and care in this space through consulting work. Taking that step back, how did you know that Eris was the right next step? You mentioned that you had that scientific background, you're in environmental sciences. The master's program came serendipitously and sparked that interest. But then after you had graduated, how did you get from that point to saying, this is the work that we need to do, this is the space and the way we're going to be operating in it? Was that something that you were navigating yourself? Was that something you were navigating with your co-founder? How did that all come to play?
First and foremost, I think there was something about the timing when I finished my master's degree, which was December of 2019, right before the COVID pandemic. Coming out of that program, feeling a little bit destabilized in general, thinking about how do I find my way back into the workplace? Is that the path that I want to pursue? Reflecting on my previous workplace experiences and thinking about how those felt really rigid and I felt really confined in a lot of ways that prevented me from bringing this thinking into my professional life. And then compounding that with relocating provinces, first of all, compounding that with being stuck indoors for a long period of time due to COVID. I had a lot of time to think and really reflect on what is it that I want out of my career on a personal level, and where am I going to be able to engage with this work in a truly meaningful way, in an in-depth way. Eras is really the result of 8 years of collaboration, Jackie and I, and having a lot of really aligned ways of working, of thinking about these things, and really wanting to create a space. We sometimes call Eras our lab to experiment with these different ways of working and being and talking about futures thinking and strategic foresight. So Eras had a slow emergence post masters and now to the present. But it was really about, for us, being able to do this type of work with clients and collaborators who are really driven and motivated by this different way of working as well, and in a way that would allow us also to practice the futures that we're imagining. We're thinking about vastly different worlds from the one that we live in today, but we are also always thinking about what are the opportunities for us to bring some pieces of those worlds into our present. And Eras is a place where we're doing that, thinking about how are we working differently, how are we resisting that urgency culture, especially as a new business in the startup phase. How are we resisting that need to always be working, always be producing, that way of tying our value to our work and only our work? How are we resisting those things as we're building Eras? And how is this now a way for us to practice those new worlds that we're hoping to bring into life for future generations? There's a few things there in terms of what do I want my own professional and working life to look like? How do I want to be able to do this work with the flexibility and the space that it needs? And how can we create something amongst ourselves, but also with our clients, our collaborators, our network that really will be able to grow and adapt and shift as it needs over time, again, to break out of some of that confinement workplaces can introduce into our lives. Eras is our lab to practice and also to experiment.
Do you find that the clients that you're attracting and that the individuals you're able to work with and organizations you're able to work with come to you with that different way of thinking and living and working in place? Or do you find that your work has to set that new baseline when you start engaging with these clients initially?
It's a bit of both. I think there are clients who come to us who have been engaged in this way of thinking and working for a while and are looking for a collaborator in that. For example, we are currently working with Policy Horizons Canada, the Foresight arm of the federal government, on thinking about what does it mean and look like to integrate Indigenous perspectives and practices in foresight within the context of government. Those folks are super interested in this work and have been engaged in it for a while and are really incredible foresight practitioners with this desire to be more expansive in their practice. But I think there are other clients who are looking for that change management type support. They're wanting to really transform their organization, whether that is structure or the way that it operates, because they're interested in this idea of equitable futures, of flourishing futures, of being part of some kind of larger systemic change. But there is a bit of a gap in terms of how to get there. And that's where our practices come in, because we're getting into that deeper rooted place of, okay, if this is how we're operating presently, these very rigid HR policies and our understanding of work is driven by what our understanding of value is. If this is what our norm, our baseline is, we have to start thinking about where that comes from. Whose vision is this based on? What worldview is really guiding the way that we work? And is this aligned with the type of future, the type of change that we're imagining for ourselves? And if not, then we have to get in there. We have to do that deeper work and we have to start practicing different ways of being. A lot of it is about uncovering some truths about ourselves as organizations, as clients who come to us, and then thinking about, is this in fact in alignment with how I want to be operating, or the services I want to be delivering, or the people that I want to be reaching? Doing that bit of auditing and assessing of where we're at before we start thinking about how do we get to where we want to go. Because that's really where the tension comes in when we're thinking about, we want to live in equitable futures, but we're operating in really inequitable ways currently. How do we get in there and do that work on ourselves before we start to do that dreaming and that visioning?
It almost sounds like, I'm not sure if you would name it in so many terms, but almost a framework towards change management. It sounds like there are steps along the way that you've been able to navigate, starting with that audit or identification phase onwards. Do you find that you're able to apply models of change, not rigidly, but are you able to apply them in a way that works for various businesses so that you can go to them and say, we've done this and then we're going to do X, Y, and Z again, and they have that model? Or is it something you have to tailor and build every single time for each new organization you engage with?
At a fundamental and conceptual level, we have an understanding of change that we like to introduce folks to. Again, getting to this idea of what are the roots of this? What is this rooted in? So then we can then understand how the rest of this came to be. We have a framework to help us think about what is required for transformative systemic change. But the process that happens after that is going to be different for every organization. And that very much depends on where we're at in terms of our understanding of some of these worldviews and systems that really drive us to operate in the way that we do. We're building out a model right now around a tree. We use a tree as a metaphor to help us understand change. Thinking about what is the soil that this tree is growing from? What are the roots of this tree? How healthy are they? How does the root and the soil support the trunk and the branches and the leaves? And starting to think about systems in a more tangible way, because I think systems thinking is another thing that a lot of us can do really intuitively and really inherently, but the academic nature of systems thinking can muddy the waters a little bit. But if we think about a tree in itself is a living system. This is a vascular system that is designed to transport nutrients in and across this organism. So if we think about the tree as the system, we think about the organization as the tree, and now we start to overlay these understandings, we can again go to and have those conversations about, okay, what is the root of the issue here? Is the problem we have some decaying leaves and branches, and we simply just need to prune them and then things will be a lot better or closer towards our goal? Or are we dealing with soil that's been contaminated? And now we have to think about What's the long-term strategy for healing this tree that is rooted in this contaminated soil? So it helps us think about levels of intervention, ways that we can practice at different levels of the organization to different depths within the system. But the way that that unfolds, and again, the process is going to look different for every client, but the framework is really helpful for us to get to that place of what is it we're really trying to do here?
As someone who has participated through a workshop where you had that analogy and framework of the tree, I was mind blown when I saw it portrayed in that way. Because there's one thing to talk about the roots of a system and understanding that certain things are so deeply rooted that impacts the way certain organizations or individuals could grow or flourish or not. But I loved that perception that you shared, which was almost like another layer of what do we then give back into the roots? When those leaves fall, what comes down and what then reintegrates, which was a whole other layer that I hadn't considered. Absolutely love what you're doing there.
And this is why I love this framework because I'm always looking for ways to engage around these really complex and difficult topics in a more intuitive way. And again, I think this comes from being in academic and institutional spaces. As someone who was the first person in my family to attend university ever, I remember feeling so overwhelmed with the language and the pace and this prioritization of a certain type of speaking and learning. I always reflect back to that. And when I'm working with my clients, I'm thinking about how can we make this more accessible, intuitive, engaging. I think about what is a common experience a lot of us would have. I'm sure a lot of us have seen trees, have raised and grown plants of our own. These are things we're familiar with. So, how can we use that to get into this complexity and take it out of that really heady academic space that can feel a little bit off-putting for people? That's why I love the tree. I think we've all had some experience with a plant of some sort. So hopefully that's a good common ground for us. Because then the metaphor, the analogy, the framework grows from there. We all can now apply our own understanding, our own way of thinking about these issues through this thing as simple as a tree. And you can take it as far as you can. And it's meant to be the place from which we start our exploration.
And that's beautiful because a lot of Eris Foresight consulting work is grounded in this idea of co-creation, of being able to work together in a space. And this idea that you're making it accessible and relatable seems like a requirement of successful co-creation, because otherwise, if we don't understand each other, how can we create together meaningfully? I wonder, what are some other keys that you found in addition to that for successful co-creation together? Based on your experiences with other individuals and organizations, have there been other foundational pieces that you've seen come to the surface that are required to actually make meaningful change through co-creation?
I have definitely had a lot of lessons learned in this space. I will say one thing that we try to practice at Eras, and I've tried to practice for the past several years in my client work, is bringing that relationality to the work in a very tangible, practical way of being in relationship with somebody. At Eras, we actually call our first interactions with potential clients visits. We invite you to come for a visit. Bring your tea, bring your blanket. We'll have a chat. We'll get to know one another. And bringing a sense of ease and slowness to the working relationship to allow that relationship to develop over time has been really important for trust building. Taking the time to share about myself, asking the person that I'm working with to share about themselves, getting to know one another, articulating our expectations for the work and the relationship right at the outset has been really valuable in terms of, again, building that trust so that when we get to that uncomfortable and difficult point in the work, we have some foundation where We have built some trust. We know the direction we're moving towards together. And we've come around this relationship as our center point to say, when things do get sticky and difficult, we still have this we can come back to, and we can adjust and shift this relationship as we need. Being relational in the work, inviting that stillness and slowness and ease from the beginning to help again set the tone for the trust building has been really important. And I think also in terms of creating that successful co-creative engagement or relationship, a lot of it for me has been about giving the space and time that's necessary for the work. Some of what we get into, especially with our organizational policy audits, for example, I've done a lot of work around organizational equity audits and looking at the policies and looking at the practices of the workplace. That can be really challenging for people, especially for the clients that we work with who are so purpose-driven, who are doing such incredible work in community and are confronted with some things in their policies or practices that maybe aren't as supportive of everyone in that workplace as we initially thought. Holding this idea that we can be doing really excellent, amazing work, and also we have some gaps in our understanding and we may be causing harm to individuals that we never intended. Holding space for both of those things, having to confront those realizations can be destabilizing at an emotional level. So we try to integrate at ERAs some somatic therapy practices into our engagements to help folks understand that you may have an emotional response to this professional thing that we're working on, and that's okay and that's welcome. And sometimes what we need to process our emotions is time to sit with them and time to be with them. Sometimes our projects have very long timeframes because we need that space to get to the midway point of the project where we're saying, okay, this is what we found. It's going to be a little bit uncomfortable, but let's take some time to sit with this before we move ahead. I've had clients take from 2 weeks to 6 months to do that processing and reflecting before we come back and we say, okay, now where are we going? What are we doing with this information? And how are we moving towards that future that we want to be in? Really being aware of some of those pressures that we have, especially coming in as external consultants with budget and time frame, trying to be very open and upfront about our process from the beginning so we can have that time, and integrating some of these practices that have been helpful for us as individuals in our own learning and growing journey into the professional work has been really valuable. And clients appreciate it. Clients appreciate being seen in that way and having the opportunity to go through something that is a little bit difficult without the pressure of a budget or a timeline breathing down their neck. So looking at creative ways we can engage with more flexibility is really important for that co-creative process.
That's the first time I've heard someone reference the use of somatic coping practices in a business context. And I was wondering if you would be able to share some examples of what this might look like, if it's something that you would guide clients through, or is it something that you suggest for them and they take away and they bring back? What are those types of practices that you found have really helped your clients as you've worked through this?
So I think just welcoming those conversations from the beginning has been really helpful. Sharing our own experiences with having to confront some realities, some truths that are uncomfortable, making space for it to be known that this could be an emotional experience and that's welcome here is a big first step, because especially as women, we're taught that we don't do emotions in the workplace. Leave that at the door, leave that at your house. We're not doing emotions in our professional lives. And that's so impossible and also so harmful for us all to be repressing our feelings all the time. Sometimes simply making the space for that is hugely transformative for clients. Again, just to be seen and to be offered the space and time to have feelings and feel them. We also have more in-depth practices that we'll do if we're working with a client over a long period of time. We like to do this, especially if we're gathering in person, and we call it feelings field trip. Essentially, what we do is we bring some of these somatic practices where we're learning how to titrate an emotional experience, where we're asking folks to think about a time where you felt a little bit embarrassed, or think about a time where you felt really overjoyed, or any selection of emotional experiences we want to explore. And we ask them to go inward, reflect on what that experience was like for you emotionally, but also physically. What does that feel like in your body? How can you maybe feel that sensation, maybe just 2 or 5% more than you're currently feeling it? And then how can we learn how to step away and leave that where it was? And doing that process of being a little bit more in tune with what those physical sensations of emotion are, so that we can learn to recognize them when they come up later on in our engagement and in our work, where we can say, oh, I'm feeling something that maybe could be embarrassment. And I know what this feels like now because I've practiced it. And I also know that I'm capable of sitting with this and letting it pass through my system so that I can move forward with a more clear mind and a more clear spirit. So feelings field trip is not something that we do with every client for sure, but when we're gathering with a group of people in person, when we're going to be together for an extended period of time, when we know we have some stuff coming up that might elicit emotional responses, has been really helpful for folks in just having that practice as an individual that maybe we don't have access to in other places in our lives, and then also helping us prepare for those more challenging bits of the work has been really valuable.
And that's something that I hold near and dear to my heart as well. This idea of bridging the personal and the professional, or personal flourishing in order to achieve community flourishing. And at some point along the way, we've been taught that the personal stays personal and the business stays with business. And that's just the way it should be in order for one to run more efficiently without the other. And it's not working. Feelings field trip is awesome, and also cool name for it. I want to
Make
go
it
on a
seem
feelings field
fun.
trip.
This is something you want to do, I promise.
Yes, absolutely. I think that is important, recognizing where you stand, how you feel and react. One of the questions that I have is how you bring that personal lens into a community or business and organization space. One of the things that you had mentioned quite a bit earlier on is this idea of Eris Foresight standing for flourishing for all. You're also working with organizations and companies and individuals that also want flourishing or success in some way, shape, or form. I was wondering how you would define flourishing from an individual and an Eris Foresight perspective, and if that ever bumps up against how clients or organizations might define flourishing and how those two things interact. Because it's interesting, the intersections of what it could mean and the various layers and gradations of what flourishing might mean to different individuals or organizations.
This is an interesting question, and one that I think about a lot, especially for me as an individual. What does flourishing mean? And I think after a long period of time of trying to separate my identity from my work and trying to understand my value as a person and not somebody who produces labor, my understanding of flourishing is really about connection. It's about being able to live a life in which I feel connected to the land that I'm living on. I feel like I have a relationship and I understand that. Feeling connected to my family, my extended family, anyone who I would put into that family group, feeling like we have really strong relationships, like we can turn to one another. And this is not something that I've always had in my life. As somebody who carries Métis ancestry and mixed settler ancestry, I did not have the same access to my Métis family that I did to my white family, my dad's family. So thinking about if I could plot myself into the future, if I think about my great great grandchildren, wanting them to feel so strongly connected to their family and their extended family and to know who they are and where they come from. I think about being really connected to community, knowing who my neighbors are, knowing where to turn in the event of a stressful time, emergency situation, or having that really localized and geographically connected community. I think about being connected to a higher purpose. And this is where I start to really think about how we disrupt our understanding of work, feeling like, yes, I know what my purpose is here. I know what my role here is in community, in this specific physical geographic community, in my larger extended community, and I'm able to fulfill that role because I understand what it is and I have the tools to be able to do what it is. And just expanding this idea of connectedness outward and outward to all places or aspects of our life. I think that for me is really where flourishing lies, because it is calling back to a way of being that my ancestors engaged with. And it's also really confronting this deep-rooted individualism that we find ourselves in the present that makes us feel so isolated and so disconnected. And that's such a hurdle to overcome. So for me, that's where my notions of flourishing come in, which I think can be expanded. I can have this conversation with some clients around what does connectedness look like for you? Connected to your own clients, connected to the people who access your services, connected to the resources that you require to run whatever this business is. There is definitely a bumping up against for sure in terms of what flourishing looks like, especially in the future space where we get into these really tech focused futures where tech is going to solve all our problems, including our isolation and disconnectedness from one another. And it's just like, okay, maybe. And also, we're still humans. So how are we actually going to be feeling, again, that physical sensation of connectedness of when you're in relationship with something or someone? So there are definitely a lot of challenges. And one way that I like to bring it back is thinking we're not living in these futures. We're thinking about these futures for the generations that will follow us, our kids, our grandkids, our great grandkids. What do we want for them? If we're imagining futures that are replicating the systems that we're living in, and we can see and observe these challenges that we're having as a collective, is that what we want for them? And if not, what's the work that we start today to shift their worlds for tomorrow? I think finding what is that connection to the future that we might viscerally feel. I know not all of us want to have kids, but all of us want to be connected in some way. For those people who are coming after you, what do you imagine for them? Because our ship has sailed. We're not living in that future, but what do we want for them? And then this brings me back to what is our responsibility now to shaping those worlds? And how do we start doing that now and not 10, 20, 50 years from now, but today?
I think that's so important and so key. And it almost comes full circle to that earlier comment you had about how somehow along the way, Foresight and Futures became this academic, structured exercise that often can take the heart out of it, in that you can think about it as a puzzle, maybe to be solved, or the perfect combination of trends and signals to create these various scenarios. But what happens if you were to actually place yourself in that scenario? Or where is the sense of community or love or heart in that space once you've finished that exercise? I do really appreciate that perspective because it's something that can get lost in the technicality of futures work sometimes.
I think, like any academic pursuit or professional pursuit, we're so trained to leave our humanity and our emotions and things that make us a human out of the picture. I was actually just reading a paper from 1989 about the need to separate emotions from reason, to have this clear scientific pursuit that is not swayed by our emotional connection to the topic, or this myth of objectivity that we've developed through the scientific method, but I think has also spread into anthropology and into cultural studies and now into futures as well, that we can be objective in our imaginings of the future, which is a myth. I think that we're always applying our own lenses and our own understandings and our own emotionality, whether or not we realize it. These are not things that we can just put behind a door and they'll stay in there. They come with us wherever we go. So I think it's about being aware of that. And then I always come back to this idea of responsibility as futurists who are putting these visions into the world, who are pouring energy into these scenarios and these imaginings. What is our responsibility to ensuring that the people who will live in those possibilities are living in a connected and healthy way and not just experiencing the challenges that we're experiencing and have been experiencing, but potentially even more so.
Quite a few times in this conversation, we've alluded to this idea of the future. If you were to think of your future 5, 10 years from now in the future of Eris, what would you like to see?
For Eras, what I am hoping to see in 5 to 10 years is a growing community of folks who are practicing and doing this work, because I know we're out there and we're doing it and we feel a little bit disconnected right now. So I think one dream I have for Eras is playing some kind of role of convener of all of these amazing futurists who are doing decolonial futures, equitable futures, indigenous futures, having some kind of way of convening all of that incredible work that's going on and expanding it. We're thinking about how do we grow these practices? How do we put them out into the world and watch them grow and adapt over time? And really start to see a shift away from this corporate foresight realm that I think a lot of folks who come out of SFI will find themselves in, or people who do change management type work will find themselves in. Shifting away from that really corporate driven foresight towards this more responsible foresight. So how are we doing futures thinking, strategic foresight in responsible and ethical ways? And how is that the standard for the practice without getting into this need to certify who can be a futurist? That's what I'm hoping our organization can play a role in, expanding this idea of responsibility, expanding this idea of ethical futures, expanding this idea of we're putting visions of the future out into the world and they might take off. So what's our responsibility for that? So hoping to see Eras play a bigger role in that way. And then for me personally, continuing to work in a different way to hold on to some of those practices that I'm trying so desperately right now to embody. My work is not my only value. There's time, there's space. I can move with slowness and ease, and what is meant for me will come to me. I also think about wanting to grow my family as a business owner, thinking about what does it look like to be a mother and a business owner and to also work and move in this way? How can I model that for my children? How can I start to practice those futures I'm dreaming of today in my work, in my relationships, in my community? So just hoping I can continue to do that.
Well, you're doing a wonderful job so far towards that future that you're dreaming of. And as Eris starts to convene that community, sign me up. If listeners want to connect with you or with Eris and they want to join, they want to collaborate, or they want to be part of that movement, how can they get in touch with you? Are there any calls to action you might have? Anything on the horizon that you might want to share?
You can find us at erisforesight.co. We have a page there where you can reach out to us in multiple ways. You can find me personally on Instagram, LinkedIn, at Samantha Matters. I'm happy to connect with people there. You can also follow Eris Foresight and Consulting on LinkedIn, where we will be sharing some resources, some blog posts, some articles, this way of thinking, what we're finding interesting at the moment, examples of our work that you can check out. And then on the horizon, this year, we're hoping to launch our Decolonial Futures online course, which is built for Foresight practitioners to introduce and experience some of these different ways of futuring and doing Foresight. So a few things coming up you can definitely watch out for, and always feel free to connect with us however is best for you.
That's so exciting. Thank you so much, Sam, for this conversation. Thank you for sharing your insights with us. Your visions of the future are so inspiring. And I know that there are so many insights here that listeners can glean, whether they're brand new to the space or whether they're established practitioners. So again, appreciative of the time and your insight and wisdom.
Thank you so much. This was so lovely. I'm so happy to be involved, and thank you so much for the invitation.
And that's a wrap on this episode of Futurist Hub. I hope you found this conversation with Samantha Matters as grounding and expansive as I did. What really stayed with me from my conversation with Sam was how thoughtfully she considered the way we relate to change and how we can do it in a way that considers the people we're in relationship with. Personally, I also really resonated with the way Sam is building her business in an equally thoughtful way, in a way that is clearly not just for the needs of today, but for the betterment of tomorrow. She's striking a true balance, not a work-life balance, but a whole-life balance that is so hard to find in today's hustle culture. Ultimately, Sam's insights offer a powerful call to a different way of living and practicing futures. If this episode resonated with you, please share it with someone who's dreaming of a better future and maybe needs a little reminder that dreaming is a practice worth protecting. Make sure to follow Futurist Hub wherever you get your podcasts. And until next time, keep imagining, keep co-creating, and keep working towards better futures for all.